Hello and welcome to Macros with Mythili, the ETNOW show that takes a hard look at all the major developments in India and overseas. Well, if there's one development that's got the world transfixed, it's a dramatic collapse in the price of crude oil in recent weeks. The price of the Indian basket has more than halved from the time the Modi government took over in May 2014. In fact, it's fallen from 108 a barrel to just below 30, closer to 25 a barrel on 19th of January 2016. With seasoned observers predicting that oil will fall to perhaps $20 a barrel, and some even talking of $10 a barrel, we seem to be entering a new phase altogether, one that has serious implications for economic growth, for geopolitics, and possibly even for global warming. So what does all this mean for the world, for us in India? We're going to try and make sense of all this with our panel of experts, who between them have perhaps the best insights on the subject. So let me welcome Sanjaya Baru, Director for Geoeconomics and Strategy at the International Institute of Strategic Studies, and Vikram Singh Mehta, former Chairman of Shell Group of Companies in India and presently Executive Chairman, Brookings India. Welcome to the show, Vikram, Sanjay. Well, I'm going to start by asking both of you, in fact, the same question. What are the underlying factors for the sharp decline in oil prices from, as I said, $100 a barrel in mid-2014? Oil is less than $30 a barrel today, for the first time since November 2013. The International Energy Agency describes the situation as drowning in oversupply. So my first question to both of you really is, how much of the decline that we are seeing now is because of oversupply, and how much because of a contraction in demand because of slowing economic growth, especially in China? If you were to quantify both these, would you weigh in on the side of oversupply, or would you think it is demand factors that predominate? And related to that is my next question. Are these factors structural, as in reflecting a fundamental shift in demand and supply, or they're purely cyclical, in which case it's only a matter of time before the trend reverses? Let me start by throwing that question to you, Sanjay, and then I'll come to Vikram. So, Sanjay, what is your take?
Well, honestly, I can't give you a quantification of how much of the decline is due to demand and how much of it is due to supply, oversupply. But I do think that there are several factors at work. There is, of course, the long-term super cycle, the commodity super cycle turning down. Therefore, it's not just oil, but all commodities whose prices have come down. And to add to this long-term turn in the super cycle, you have specific factors affecting oil, both on the supply side and on the demand side. But I think the most recent crash, which you have seen in the last few days, is due to expectations generated by the new, the U.S.-Iran accord, and the assumption that Iran is going to pump more oil onto the market. So a variety of long-term factors, short-term factors have contributed to this sharp downturn. Between demand and supply, if you really push me, I would imagine that it is supply that is the dominant factor rather than demand, because though China's demand has gone down, overall global demand is not that much below. I mean, after all, the world economy is still growing at about 3%, and certainly India is growing at about 7%. So I would imagine supply side factors are more important than demand side factors.
Okay. So then let me ask Vikram. Vikram, would you agree that it's supply that is a predominant factor? There's too much of supply in the world, and you'd agree with the IEA and also Sanjay, Vikram?
Yes, I agree. The reason why prices come down is more to do with supply than demand. China accounts for only 1/10 of crude demand. Europe and USA together still account for 40% of demand. So when we talk about the decline in the demand for oil from China, we should keep in mind that whilst it's been material, it is not the main driver behind the fall in price. The main driver is, of course, going back 16 months or whatever, 18 months, no more actually, 2 years, it was a decision by Saudi to shift the role of marginal supplier or the swing producer to the US. So they just turned on the taps and decided to defend market share. So they've been pumping over 10 million barrels a day. Then supply from Iraq, Libya exceeded all expectations. And now, of course, we have Iran, which is looking to increase export by 500,000 barrels a day in 3 months and 1 million barrels a day over 12 months. Now, whether they succeed or not is another matter, but the market is certainly factoring this new addition of supply into the equation. So we there's no doubt in my mind that this is a situation very much to do with overhang of supply than to do with demand. Now, the second question is this structural? I think it is structural in some senses. I think that the demand, on the demand side, OECD demand peaked in 2005, and since then, in absolute terms, OECD demand has fallen by 10% since 2005, and it's trending downwards. China and India will continue to be the main drivers of demand for transportation fuel, but when you look at when you compare their demand to the past, you'll have to recognize that demand as such is now on a secular downturn at a global level. Not necessarily in India and China, but at a global level. On the other hand, supply, if the 5 Gulf countries continue to act in unison, that is Saudi, Oman, UAE, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates, and if Iraq and Iran are in the market again, then we are going to have increased production capacity, plus, of course, there is a huge amount of inventory both on land and afloat in supertankers. So there is a structural shift, I think. This does not mean that prices will continue to fall. I think prices will probably start to rise again, but by the third or fourth quarter of this year. But I suspect that when the rise happens, it will be a modest rise.
Okay, well, that's good news to hear. But Sanjay, as both you and Vikram said, when you talk of oil, the role of geopolitics is never very far. So what is the role of geopolitics really in the recent fall? There are many theories floating around that this is a bid to bring Putin and the Russian economy to its knees. It's a Saudi bid to push oils low so that shale oil becomes unprofitable. Ensure that even when Iran returns to the global market, it won't get the kind of profits that it thought it would. And it's an underlying Shia-Sunni battle between the Saudis and Iran. What is your take on all this? Which of these factors do you think explain it, or are these all conspiracy theories which that really never carry much weight, but people like to talk about these things?
Well, I mean, of all these theories, I think the least significant is the Shia-Sunni conflict. I think the most significant factor is really the role that Saudi Arabia is playing. There is no denying the fact that at least in the beginning, when the downturn began, the exaggerated, and I use the word advisedly, expectations of U.S. Energy independence, was meant to in fact dampen expectations about demand, and I think that was aimed really at putting a squeeze on not just Russia but Venezuela and Saudi Arabia. So I wouldn't be surprised if oil strategists and planners and geopolitical analysts in the United States were exaggerating the changes in the structure of oil supply happening 5-10 years back because of the exploitation of shale oil, etc., to dampen expectations, to push prices down. So that element may well have been there. And certainly I think Saudi Arabia has also played a geopolitical game in the sense that by allowing price to fall to a level where shale becomes expensive to pursue, they have tried to halt investments in the United States. So some of these games I'm pretty sure are being played. But I think they would not work without the overall market context. And the overall market context, as both Vikram and I have just mentioned, is that of oversupply and a slowdown in demand. So there is a fundamental market context which is probably been manipulated, or the impact of these changes exaggerated by deliberate moves on the part of both Saudi Arabia and the United States. Going forward, you could well see a situation where there is a sudden decline in supply because of a shutdown of various expensive sources of supply, and that could have the effect of pushing the price up.
Well, I'm afraid, Sanjay, I'll have to just interrupt you there for a moment. Just hold your thoughts, because it's time for us to slip into a very short break. But please do stay with us. We'll be back very soon. Watching Macros with Mythili, and we're trying to make sense of the dramatic collapse in crude oil prices, what it means for India and the global economy. Vikram, before the break, we were talking about the role of geopolitics. But whatever the reason, what do such low prices really mean for exploration and production spends by oil companies? Most oil majors are understood to have already cut their capital spending. And the JP Morgan expert, Kolanovic, predicts that oil prices will soon shoot up as a consequence. His theory comes from looking at past instances of when crude has dramatically underperformed the equities market, as it did in January this year. In much of the 10 instances that he studied during the last 30 years this has happened, oil has eventually come back with a vengeance. Do you expect that to happen this time also? And if yes, do you have any timeline? And would you like to hazard a guess about where oil prices would be, say, a year from now? Or is that really a mug's game?
Well, I think it's a mug's game, but let me, notwithstanding hazard a guess, since I'm not in the oil business anymore. I think that prices will probably fall a little bit further before they start to rise again. And then maybe the third quarter or so, they'll be ranging between 40 and 50. I don't expect the price of oil over the year to average more than $50. But, and the reason I say that is threefold. One is there is an overhang of supply, and we talked about that, and I don't think that's going away in the near future. Second is that the price will start to rise because a lot of production, especially in the U.S., the light oil or the shale oil producers are now running a cash loss business, and they're going to have to shut down. The reason they haven't shut down so far is that there's a lag between the fall in the price of oil and the movement of drilling rigs away from the field. And my sort of rough estimate is that that lag is about 8 months. So we are coming to the period where a large number of drilling rigs in the U.S. are moving away, either closing down or they're moving away from oil fields. The third factor that I think is going to push prices up is that the banks are heavily exposed to energy companies. And so on one hand, you're going to have energy companies sort of closing down. On the other hand, you're going to have banks also shutting off the credit supply. Then you've got, you know, the whole issue of geopolitics. The Middle East is a volatile area, and one must not underestimate the possibility of the unexpected pushing up, or let's say choking off supply somewhat, and thereby pushing up prices. So the fundamentals, if one was to just focus on demand and supply, I think we would probably see an upturn in the price of oil, but there will be some volatility. But in the end, I suspect the average would be no more than $50 or so over the duration of this of the next 12 months. It's a mug's game, so I'll be ready to be proved wrong a year from now.
Sanjay, would you agree with that assessment of Vikram's? In fact, Dr. Shankaracharya, the former CEA, had also said that he expects oil to be at about $50 a barrel by the end of the year. And he said the rupee would be somewhere between 70 and 75. And also, another question that I wanted to ask you, since you're an economist by training, is there a link, do you see, between oil prices and the collapse of the equity market? Or is that more a consequence of what is happening in China, the US Fed action? So what is your take on this? Where can we expect to find oil prices, and what link do you see between equity prices and oil prices?
Well, as Vikram has correctly said, it's a mug's game. I remember about a year back, Mr. Mukesh Ambani speaking in Delhi at a function where he predicted that the oil price would settle around $70 a barrel, and now where we are. So if he can't get it right, I'm afraid we are a small change in looking at the market and trying to predict a price. I do think we are in uncertain times because of the combination of factors. As you correctly said, there are cyclical factors, there are structural factors, and there are geopolitical factors. All three of them are driving the oil market. So what will happen a year from now is something which is very difficult to predict. But on the question of the equities market, well, frankly, the equities market has been coming down for a variety of reasons, and particularly in India, I think there's been a lot of uncertainty on the economic front, on the basic macroeconomic front. There has been concern about lack of adequate focus on investment within India. At the same time, there's concern about China's overall economic slowdown, which has hit trade. Indian exports have sharply fallen. There is concern about exchange rate movements. So a variety of factors apart from oil have dampened expectations. The government in India has tried to push up expectations by emphasizing the fact that India is the world's fastest growing large economy. Our growth rate is still 7%, and the IMF and the World Bank and a lot of these institutions are trying to be supportive of India by flagging the positive. But I think a lot will depend on what kind of push the budget 1 month from now gives to the Indian economy and to investments in the Indian economy. I would imagine that till then the market would remain subdued.
Vikram, what does the return of Iran to the international oil market mean globally and also for India in particular? Correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that we have been buying from Iran despite the US sanctions, but of course much smaller quantities. Now that Iran is back, it's completely kosher as far as US is concerned. What difference will it make for us? Also, will the decade-old discussions about an Iran-Pakistan-India gas pipeline be revived? Given the deep mutual suspicion between India and Pakistan and the problems of getting the pipeline financed, secured, insured, etc., as well as getting the pricing of gas right, will it ever see the light of day?
Iran and India have a long-standing relationship, and you're right. Even at the height of the sanctions, India was doing some business with Iran, but it was quiet. It was under the radar screen, and it was in rupees. In fact, there was no exchange of money. It was almost on credit terms. I think the withdrawal of sanctions does offer India a huge opportunity to help revive the Iranian oil industry. Iran will need, I suspect, $100 billion to get their entire oil industry back on track. It is not at all clear to me that the Western banks are going to be ready to invest in Iran just yet. There's a lot of uncertainty about Iranian politics and Iranian commitment to this whole sanction issue. So I think India could play a role here. India could actually enter the Iranian market. It could forge a long-term supply deal and also invest in their upstream fields, use its technological expertise to help revive the Iranian industry. So I see this as an opportunity and something that I hope the government of India and the Ministry of Petroleum will look at pretty thoroughly and, in a sense, aggressively. So far as the gas pipeline projects are concerned, well, this is a project that makes economic sense, and we all know it makes economic sense, although the economics of a transcontinental or transnational pipeline has to some extent been eroded because of the price of gas. Gas prices come down sharply as well. But the reality is that there is Pakistan, and the security concerns are not going to be wished away or cannot be wished away. So there's a much stronger likelihood of the sort of Iran-Pakistan pipeline being, in a sense, moving ahead, and then eventually possibly a Pakistan-India connection. Then for an Iran-Pakistan-India pipeline being agreed to all at once. I am not optimistic about the pipeline coming into fruition in the near or medium term, but I am certainly I would certainly recommend that conversations about that project continue to be held.
Vikram, you've been writing a lot about renewables, but what is the impact of low oil prices? What does it mean for the push towards renewables? After all, the fact is it is not so much concern for the environment as much as high and volatile oil prices. That was really the main driver in the push towards renewables. So now will environmental concerns take a backseat, because it's going to be so much harder to make people give up their dependence on fossil fuel when it is so cheap? Vikram, what is your take on that?
Yes, I think if you just look at the economics, it becomes a little bit more difficult for one to sort of invest in solar and wind. Having said that, COP21 was a clear commitment by the entire global community to shift away from fossil fuels. And this is, I think, a real commitment. It may take a long time to, in a sense, realize, it will take a long time to convert to tangible sort of impact, but there's a commitment and a recognition that something has to be done to contain carbon emissions. Something has to be done to push the economies of all countries onto a low carbon trajectory. Now, against that backdrop and against the backdrop of sharply reducing prices in renewables, particularly with regard to solar, I think that we are going to see a disconnect between the price of oil and investment interest in solar and to a lesser extent wind. Solar, yesterday or day before yesterday, one of the solar companies offered 4 rupees 13 paisa kilowatt hour bid to the Rajasthan government. That makes it almost competitive to gas at the grid. I mean, solar is getting to reach grid parity with gas. It's already reached grid parity with oil, and much more so economic than, even in some senses economic, insofar as electricity is concerned. Now, the real issue is not whether we convert residential homes or industry or electric power from fossil fuels to solar or wind. The real issue is, can we find an alternative to diesel and gasoline for transportation? Oil or liquid fuels account for 60% of demand for liquid fuels is from the transportation sector. And so unless and until we find an alternative to the liquid fuels for transportation, oil will remain a key sort of component of the energy basket. And in that sense, everything hinges on electric vehicles and electric storage and battery storage. That's the technological change that we need to actually focus on, battery storage.
Absolutely. Sanjay, but as Vikram said, actually the dependence on oil is so extreme that one really cannot foresee in the near future a time when we will not have that kind of dependence. But as the 4th largest energy consumer in the world, which imports close to about 80% of its oil, India is today uniquely placed. But how can the government make best use of its opportunity? Presumably it's already using the savings on oil subsidies to hold up public investment. But what else can it do? Should it build up strategic reserves? Do we have the capacity to store? And does it make sense to really use scarce resources to buy a commodity if the long-term view is that the price is only going to go down further? Sanjay, what can the government do to cash in on this opportunity?
Well, I think at the moment our policy has been a correct policy, which is not to reduce domestic retail price of oil, of petrol, diesel, etc., to the extent that may be warranted by the decline in the supply price. I think the government has reduced in the last week. It has brought down petrol price marginally and diesel price marginally. But I think it's wise not to do that for 2 reasons. One, because oil and price may go up, and when it goes up, it's always more difficult to raise prices than to lower prices. But 2, also because I don't think we should be encouraging excessive consumption of petrol or diesel merely because international prices are low. I don't think in our case our petrol and diesel pricing should be shaped by international prices. It should be shaped by our understanding of what kind of fuel mix that we would like to encourage in the country. And as Vikram has correctly said, we should be moving towards public transportation and non-oil and non-diesel ways of energizing public transportation. So I would imagine in the immediate future, we should not be bringing these domestic prices down, and use the bonanza that is available to in fact reduce the fiscal deficit, to improve government budget, to improve government finances. Going forward, I think we need to, we don't need to build oil reserves. I'm not persuaded by the argument of using this to buy up too much oil and build up too many reserves, because I think all the forecasts suggest that whatever happens to oil price is unlikely to rise to a point where these reserves would make economic sense. And finally, of course, with Iran coming in and with other countries forced to continue to supply because of their own fiscal needs. I mean, after all, none of the Arab countries can afford not to export oil. They have nothing else to do apart from exporting oil to finance their own development. So I don't think supply is going to be a problem at all. So I would not waste public money at the moment in building up reserves.
Absolutely. I think there is so little of public money available at all to begin with, so I think we really need to be very, very careful about how we use it. But we've almost run completely out of time, so I'm afraid I'll have to end this discussion. What is really clear is that there are so many imponderables when it comes to oil that it's very difficult to really read the tea leaves and just say where oil will be a year from now. But clearly there are many opportunities that are presented before a country like India, which imports so much of its oil when prices are so cheap. Thank you so much, Sanjay, as well as Vikram, for joining me in this discussion. Thank you also for watching. Remember, we'll be back next week with yet another edition of Macros